Missouri School of Journalism. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. At first glance, Cuba seems like a perfect vacation destination. Gorgeous beaches, amazing food, and of course those iconic cigars. But for the past 50-plus years, Americans have mostly had to rely on descriptions of the country rather than seeing it themselves. A trade embargo set up by President John F. Kennedy during the depths of the Cold War has stood until today. But President Obama and Cuban leader Raul Castro have made sweeping changes to the relationship. A few months ago, President Barack Obama announced that the United States would restore relations with Cuba and open an embassy in Havana, the first time since ties were officially severed in 1961. In April, Obama met Castro face-to-face at a summit in Panama, and soon thereafter, the White House announced it would remove Cuba from a U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. John Kerry has said he plans to be the first U.S. Secretary of State to visit the island nation in 60 years. This week, we'll look at what it's like reporting in the communist country and what this lifting of the end to relations means for Cuba's economy and people. Joining us from London, Stephen Gibbs. He was a reporter for the BBC in Cuba before effectively getting kicked out of the country in 2007. He's now a reporter in Rio de Janeiro for CCTV, China Central Television. From Miami, Jaime Suchlicki, director of the Institute for Cuban and Cuban-American Studies, as well as a professor of history at the University of Miami. And from Cuba, Harold Cardenas Lema, a well-known government-sanctioned Cuban blogger who runs the news blog El Toque and helped form the Young Cuba blogging collective. Welcome to all of you. Harold Cardenas Lema in Cuba, tell us, if you would, about this blogging collective, La Joven Cuba, that you founded. It was effectively blocked for a time back in 2012, and then in 2013, the government sort of restored your access to blogging. What happened then, and what does this say about some of the limits on blogs from Cuba?
Yeah, first I would like to say hello to your audience. My blog has been active for 5 years long. And of course, we had 6 months with a big struggle because some people wanted to stop what we were doing or what we were writing, but it was a big fight, and we won it. It was a big fight, and I think that common sense prevailed. And that is a signal for me that Cuba is changing, because what we're doing right now in Cuba in our blog, like writing a critical point of views, I think that wasn't possible like 10 or 15 years ago. So Cuba is changing, and the Cuban blogosphere is a way to show it. And so more and more Cubans are reading blogs. There is this small group of people who are allowed to blog from within the country. What are some of the areas that you can cover as a blogger, and what specific areas, as they relate to politics and government, is it best to steer clear from for you? We pretty much write about anything. We like to write. Our blog is mostly political, but there's a whole blogosphere in this country that is very good, because if you look at the Cuban blogosphere 5 years ago, you will only find like the extremes. People saying that Cuba was everything good, and other people saying that everything was bad. And that extremes doesn't explain the country. Right now, you can find a Cuban blogosphere and a lot of people writing, saying that Cuba is a country like any other country with good things, bad things. These young people are also writing about poetry, about food, about pretty much anything. So the Cuban blogosphere is much more like Cuba right now. And I like that. I like that diversity. Stephen Gibbs, you were a reporter in Cuba for 5 years. Tell us what it was like to be a reporter then. How difficult was it for you to get the news and tell it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were some very fundamental problems with being a reporter in Cuba, mainly in terms of access to officials. It's very, very difficult to get Cuba to put its point of view. You know, we'd repeatedly be asking the CPI, the press center, the foreign press center there, for interviews, and sometimes, almost more often than not, really, usually, you get no response and no one to, as I say, put the government perspective. So you had to work, you know, in order to work and report, you had to work your way around that. And that is sometimes in your report saying, well, the government has previously said this, or in a speech, Fidel Castro may have made this point. And I think that I think probably Cuba's is getting and will get better at that. But it was an impediment really for both us as journalists and for Cuba to sort of put its point of view. That aside, I mean, what a fascinating place and what a fascinating story. I've since worked in Mexico and Brazil, and whenever I meet people and they say, oh, you've worked abroad, where have you worked? I mentioned Brazil, I mentioned Mexico, but it's Cuba everyone wants to talk about. Without question, it fascinates people, and I certainly found it absolutely fascinating to live there.
Professor Suchlicki, we have seen that there has been, with the development of technology, some new online voices from within Cuba writing about the country, about its politics, about its challenges. What do you make of this sort of new media that's emerged? Is it playing much of a significant role in public discourse in Cuba?
Well, first of all, the extent of the internet penetration in the island is less than 3%. So less than 3% of the Cuban population has access to the internet. A lot of these bloggers are writing for outside consumption in Cuba. Many of them are not seen or heard or known. So it's a very, very limited, very controlled activity, and the Cuban government is not going to allow open internet or allow access to information. That is, they're very jealous about controlling the information in the island. And
yet still there's more information available than there was 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Is that fair to say?
Oh, sure. The technology is there, and many people in Miami send telephones to relatives. They have access like that. But also remember, Cuba is a racially divided country. The bulk of the population, 60%, is black, and the rest is white, and so on. So they don't get the blacks don't get money from Miami to buy cellulars. They don't get remittances from Miami to do anything. So the money that is being sent from Miami and outside to Cuba for technology is hitting only a sector, the white sector of the population, which is that right now less than 40%.
Harold Cardenas Lema in Cuba. You heard Professor Suchlicki talking about how low internet penetration is in Cuba. As that figure grows, how do you think that will? How do you think the Cuban government will meet some of those challenges, given that you worked for an officially sanctioned government blogging collective and your blogging collective was effectively shut down for a time? What's going to happen when instead of there being dozens of bloggers, there are hundreds or thousands?
Yes. First, I would like to remark that the Cuba of 2015 is not the same that the Cuba of 2010 or 2005. It's not the same Cuba. This country, if you were missing the last 5 years in this country, you miss a lot. And also, this is a country that is still under aggression, economic aggression and all type of aggression, and that pretty much conditions everything we do. Right now, with the measures that President Obama is doing, the civil society of this country, now we are in a much better position to make changes in the inside of the country, because with that pressure of the U.S. being lifted up, now we can do so much more. Also, the information flow in Cuba, I was listening to Professor Suchlicki. The information flow is not through internet. He's right. The internet is very, very slow in Cuba, and it's very little, and not too many people have access to it. So the information flow goes mainly through something called paquete. Paquete is people exchanging information by hard drives, using hard drives, from people to people. And that is, I think that Cuba is one of the few countries in the world that have that. That's because we don't have any internet. And the political discussion about what's going on in the Cuban blogosphere or anything in the public, it doesn't go through the internet because we don't have it. But it does exist. It exists through a list, because the people in Cuba that have access to the emails are so much. So that is a reality. I think that the Cuban government is currently aware that the internet is inevitable. So they are changing their view of the internet. They're still pretty concerned about the internet that can be used against the government, but I think that they're aware that they have to change that view and to open internet to everybody in the world, and that is inevitable. And it's better that the government does it by its own and not let other people to give the internet to the Cuban people. So I think that will be a mistake. I'm very hopeful for the next few years, but I also think that there are still some people in the government that need to be more mature about it.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This week, a look at the United States' recent decision to try and normalize diplomatic relations with Cuba and what it means for the future of the island nation. Joining us from London, Stephen Gibbs. He was a reporter for the BBC in Cuba before having his press accreditation withdrawn. From Miami, Jaime Suchlicki, director of the Institute for Cuban and Cuban-American Studies, as well as a professor at the University of Miami. And from Santa Clara, Cuba, Harold Cardenas Lema, who runs the Cuban news blog El Toque and the blogging collective Young Cuba. If you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Global Journ. Stephen Gibbs, President Obama said back in 2009 that he wanted a new beginning with Cuba. Were you surprised that he actually did make this big policy change?
I mean, I think it was expected in a way. There's always been a feeling that ultimately this is going to end. You know, the standoff would one day end, and it seemed most likely, you know, under recent presidents, under Obama, because he'd made it completely clear, really, that that's what he wanted. I mean, at no stage during his presidency did anyone, you know, has he given the impression that he was really in favor of the embargo. That said, it's absolutely unbelievable in a way to see it happen. You know, anyone who's lived in Cuba, any Cuban really, you know, under sort of 55 years old or 60 in terms of their memory, you know, their whole lives have been dominated by this standoff. And so to actually see and hear Raul Castro in Panama speak sort of warmly about a United States president is extraordinary, and all the repercussions of that we're sort of gonna see in the next few years. But yes, I mean, it's a sort of mix of feeling that it wouldn't last forever, and then sort of in awe, really, of it actually happening, you know, and us watching the consequences of that.
Professor Suchlicki, you know, you've written an opinion piece in the Miami Herald back in October, just before President Obama announced these changes. And in that piece, you argued that the U.S. shouldn't normalize relations with Cuba unless there were some significant concessions by the Cuban government in the area of human rights, politics, the economy. What did you make of this warming of ties?
Well, I think that President Obama has engaged in a foreign policy that calls for unilateral concessions to your enemies without asking anything in return. He tried it with Putin in Russia, and the end result was Putin took over Crimea. He's trying it with the Iranians, and I don't know whether he's going to obtain concessions from the Iranians. Now he's trying it with Cuba. Well, Raul Castro is an ally of Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. He is not going to change that relationship because the United States now wants to normalize relationship. We have to understand that this is a 50-year-old dictatorship, that they are planning now for the succession from Raul to a new leadership, which is totally military. The military controls the Cuban economy more than 60%. So this is the fact that Raul in Panama said, oh, that Obama is very nice and so on, these are niceties and words. but it's not being reflected by Raul Castro opening up the political process in Cuba, even opening up the economic process. So the moves that he has made, creating some individual workers and small changes, is not moving Cuba to a market economy. Cuba is not in the road to a Vietnamese economy or to a Chinese economy. Cuba remains a state control where the military controls 60% of the major enterprises. So I don't think that the policy of the administration is going to bring about major changes in Cuba.
Harold Cardenas Lema, let me get your reaction. What was the sense? What were Cuban people saying in Cuba after this happened, after this announcement was made? How are people feeling about this warming of ties? And what do you think some of the challenges will be?
I think that mostly people were very glad to hear about it. First, Cuba was completely shocked on December 17th because nobody expected that would happen. I think that we Cubans we pretty much dream about it from in a very long time, but we didn't expect that to happen for real. And that approach of our president and President Obama, it was pretty good news. But we're also very skeptical because we know that this travel that we must go to make some to get close together is not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy because there are a lot of people inside Cuba and inside the United States that makes profit from the embargo. There are a lot of people making profit from it. And we're like the collateral damage. The Cuban people is in the middle of that. And that's why we think that this is really good news what is going on right now. Maybe the main changes have to come from the United States because it's the United States the one that is applying the Cuban embargo. And it's a matter of sovereignty, I think. And it's like most Cubans see it that way. Cuba is not applying an embargo to the United States because what is happening in Baltimore. So why would the United States have apply an embargo on us? There are many ways to discuss our differences. And for example, the United States has more than 90 table discussions with China where they speak about the differences. And one of them is human rights. Why cannot the United States sit with the Cuban government and discuss about human rights every year like they do with China or like they do with Vietnam or like they do with Saudi Arabia? Many of that the U.S. officers are criticizing the Cuban government. Many of the things of human rights are being done also by Saudi Arabia, and you have very good relationship.
Well, I think as relations are restored here, there may be more opportunity for those discussions to take place between diplomats.
May I interject something here?
Sure, Dr. Suchlicki, quickly, then okay. I want to move to another subject.
First of all, we should emphasize that the economic problems of Cuba are not the result of the embargo. They're the result of an economic system implanted by the Castro brothers that doesn't work, doesn't produce, and doesn't increase human creativity. Like the Soviet Union system and like the Eastern European, the Cuban system doesn't work. The fact that there are no bananas and no potatoes and shortages in Cuba has nothing to do with the U.S. embargo, has to do with the productivity of the economic system. Cuba can buy from any country in the world, and they buy from any country in the world. It is the problem that Cuba doesn't have enough dollars to buy products. That's why there is a shortage, and Cuba doesn't produce enough.
Hold that thought just for a moment, Professor Suchlicki, because I wanted to turn to Stephen Gibbs to ask him, we're already in the midst of the 2016 presidential campaign, at least the early phases of it in the United States. Many of the Republican candidates have criticized this move by President Obama to normalize ties. If a Republican wins, might we see a shift back to a more hostile relationship between the U.S. and Cuba?
I think the process towards restoring diplomatic relations has started. I think it would be exceptionally difficult to stop that. There are major political figures from the United States visiting Cuba. There are business leaders. I think it's, to turn back this tide at this stage is going to be extremely difficult. I think, though, under a Republican things might go more slowly. And of course, that might well suit the Cubans. I think if anyone's taking this slowly at this stage, it's not the Americans, it's the Cubans. I mean, Obama made reference to that in Panama. You know, the whole process for the Cuban government is actually a lot more difficult than it is for the Americans.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This week we're focusing on how the decision by the U.S. to restore relations with Cuba will affect people in the island nation. Joining us from London, Stephen Gibbs. He was a reporter for the BBC in Cuba before losing his press accreditation in 2007. He's now a reporter for China Central Television in Brazil. From Miami, Dr. Jaime Suchlicki, director of the Institute for Cuban and Cuban-American Studies and a professor of history at the University of Miami. And from Santa Clara, Cuba, Harold Cardenas Lema, who runs the Cuban news blog El Toque and the blogging collective A Joven Cuba. Harold Cardenas Lema, could you just give us a sense, are there concerns within Cuba that as these ties are normalized with the U.S., that there may be some drawbacks for the Cuban people, that as there's greater investment, access to U.S. banks, will this lead to very dramatic changes in society that may not be beneficial for much of the population?
Yeah. Cuba, I think Cuba in this last half a century of Cuban Revolution, I think that we were very, very bad making a good economy. I think I admit that all the time. We're not very good in economics, but we did achieve huge accomplishments in making a social system that works, you know. And I think that is the main concern of the Cuban people right now. That what's going on to us, that is like an invasion of the whole Cuba is now inside the war. What is coming on to us doesn't affect the public health of Cuba. Is still very good compared to Latin America. The education in Cuba that is for free is very good also. The public safety that we have in the streets. We have a country with almost no drugs. We have a different country from Latin America. We have huge challenges in the economical and some political areas, but we also have huge accomplishments that we want to preserve. And I think that is the main goal, because all the investments that are coming to Cuba and all the foreign interests with Cuba, we don't want that to affect the good things that we have. I think that is one of our main goals, you know. And if you look at the map, and you see the size of the United States and the size of Cuba, it's very easy to recognize. And I think that I disagree with Professor Suchlicki in that. It's very good to recognize that the pressure of the United States with Cuba in half a century is significant. You know, it's not a small thing. Having the biggest economy in the world, making pressure on a small island, of course, that is significant. That country applying sanctions to companies from other countries that make trade with us, that is significant.
Let me just turn back to you, Dr. Suchlicki. And actually, if you could touch on a point that Stephen Gibbs had made about, he was contending that these changes that have been made are essentially irreversible no matter who wins the White House in 2016. Do you see things the same way?
Yeah, I think that probably if the Republicans win the White House, it will slow down. But establishing an embassy in Cuba is not a big deal. Cuba and the U.S. have had an interest section. It's not called an embassy, but they've had an interest section and a group of diplomats in Cuba, and there are a group of Cubans in Washington negotiating, talking about policy, discussing issues. So this is not going to be a major substantive change if they have an ambassador and an embassy in Cuba. Lifting the embargo, changing the trade agreements and so on, that is going to be significant. But I don't see that in the short term. That may be in the long term. But I mean, your friend from Cuba is talking about the United States embargo and the effects. There are countries in the world that don't deal with the United States, and they have a very prosperous economy. They do very well without the United States. Cuba does not do well, I emphasize it, not because of the U.S., but because the system doesn't work. And no matter what he tells us, that the health system is very good now and the school systems are very good, the health system is a disaster for the Cuban people. It's very good for the foreigners that pay in dollars, or it's very good for the military and the party officials. They use special hospitals and special clinics. But for the Cubans, there are no doctors, there's no medicine, is a disaster. And that has nothing to do with the embargo. The embargo never included medicines or food. Cubans can buy food, can buy medicine in the United States. So the fact that they don't have medicine and the food situation is not good is because the system doesn't work.
Well, let me just turn the conversation to Stephen Gibbs again. Parts of Cuba are quite isolated from the outside world, particularly outside of Havana, places where tourists visit. So how might people in these more remote areas of the country adjust as Cuba opens up over the next several years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that Jaime made is important. That the real big change is lifting the embargo. The opening an embassy, I would say is going to make more of a change than perhaps he suggests. But I totally agree. The big change is the embargo. And then as things open up, there is a big issue because the focus of a lot of the visits and a lot of the money and a lot of the people where they live who have relations in Miami who will be coming to and fro, that's Havana. But, you can look at the map and think that Cuba's a very small island. It's not that small an island, relatively speaking, certainly in the region. And, how will a much more prosperous Havana affect the rest of the country? I mean, what you see in all over Latin America, I live in Brazil, is you get this exodus from the country to the big capital of people seeking work and jobs and money and prospects. And that causes all sorts of social problems. And for the last 50 years, Cuba's very successfully, really, in its terms, managed to control that. There have been very, very strict controls on movement of Cubans within Cuba. As things change, all of that's going to change. And then, you have this risk of internal migration, and how are they going to handle that? So a whole sort of can of worms does open as the country opens up, no doubt.
And Harold Cardenas Lema, with just about 30 seconds to go, what do you think Cuba will look like 10 years from now? How will it be different than it is today?
I hope that Cuba in the next future is going to be much better than what we have right now. We deserve so much more than we have right now. And right now, like I said before, the Cubans, we are the collateral damage in the embargo. And we have to put this relationship that is going on right now in a point of no return, because that is a necessity for the Cuban people. Some of the ideas that the Professor Suchlicki was speaking about, some of that ideas embargo from 50 years ago. The President Obama himself said that doesn't work. That ideas and that things doesn't work, because from 50 years you see how separated these countries are, and we have to bring together two countries that are geographically very together.
That's all for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Many thanks to Stephen Gibbs, Jaime Suchlicki, and Harold Cardenas Lema for joining us. Global Journalist executive producer is Joshua Kransberg. Our assistant producers this week are Nasim Benchaban, Taylor Nakagawa, Jinghong Chen, Phoebe Seston, and Ava Kaus. Global Journalist studio director is Travis McMillan from RJI, and our audio engineer is Pat Akers of KBIA. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.